Let's talk now about the triangular trade. This is different than the Columbian exchange. It can be confusing, so let's decipher the two. The triangular trade are the actual trade routes from different continents. Why are they called triangular trade? Well, the trade routes make the shape of a triangle. The Columbian exchange, meanwhile, is not a specific trade route. It's just the general transfer of food and goods and ideas and diseases and people, as we'll learn shortly. So that's the difference between the triangular trade and the Columbian exchange. Now let's take the triangular trade step by step, starting in the continent of Europe, which is shaded here. Europe trades to Africa guns, ammo, and manufactured cloth, mostly in Western Africa because they can reach this coast most easily by ship. And they then participate in the slave trade of Western Africa. And slaves are sent across the Atlantic Ocean to North, South America, and the Caribbean islands. And this route from Africa to the Americas is called the Middle Passage. More on this later. But what is then brought back to Europe from the Americas? Sugar and rum. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean are vibrant with wealth. And the rum is a product of making an alcoholic beverage out of sugar. And both of these items are wanted greatly in Europe. So they complete the triangular trade routes. The triangular trade also involved exporting precious metals between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres. Now, Hernando Cortez, one of the Spanish explorers, he was an example of an explorer who wanted gold by any means necessary. This is what he said in his journal. We, the Spanish explorers, have a disease of the heart that only gold can cure. Gold and silver were exported to Europe and Asia from the Americas. And these explorers justified enslaving American Indians in gold and silver mines and on sugar plantations. Let's take a look at this political cartoon. You have the Spanish explorers saying, we give them God, they give us gold, justifying enslaving these humans for their purposes. Now, when the smallpox virus kills the Native Americans, the Aztec, the Inca, and others, Spain and Portugal, the early leaders in exploration, start using Africans as slaves. And this is the start of the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas. And here is the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of it has to do with the harvesting of sugar and sugar cane. Let's look at where the transatlantic slave trade happened. You see what's called the Slave Coast, the west coast of Africa from 1650 to 1860, and all the different routes that these slave ships took. Now notice the majority of the slaves are sent to the West Indies in the Caribbean, 4.5 million, and to South America, especially to Brazil. 5 million slaves end up on plantations in Brazil. Only 500,000 slaves end up on the northeast coast of what will become the United States. So there are many more slaves in the Caribbean and in South America than in North America. And it all centered on this sugar crop. And here you see African slaves working the sugar cane plantations. The Middle Passage, as we said, this was the leg of the triangular trade routes that deals with the forced transfer of slaves from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. And about 20% of Africans die on each ship during the voyage. Each slave ship had about 20% of Africans die. That's a staggering figure. And you see a sketch of a slave ship and the inhumane way that slaves were packed in the lower level of these slave ships. And what did the lower levels look like? Like this. Slaves were chained to the holds. Some slaves were punished by being thrown overboard. And there were some rebellions. The slaves realized we are outnumbering our owners. So let's plan a rebellion. Most were unsuccessful. Slavery, let's back up. Let's back up and talk more about slavery. Slavery did not start with Africans in the 1500s. Slavery has been around for thousands of years. Slavery before 1500 was not based on race. It was not based on the color of your skin. Let's take a look at some examples of slavery in ancient times. Ancient Rome's farmers used prisoners of war as slaves. Muslim rulers in Africa enslaved non-Muslim African prisoners of war. So you have Africans enslaving other Africans. And the Vikings of the Middle Ages raided villages to get slaves for their purposes. Now, talking about slavery in the Americas in the 1500s, that was based on race. Why? Well, the Europeans, who were so important to the slave trade, they thought black people in general were naturally inferior human beings. They thought they were born inferior. And there's a philosopher from Scotland named David Hume who is read by a lot of people in the 1700s. And this is what he says about the African people. He says, I suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior. He says, I suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion. That shows the extreme racism in many people's thoughts during this day. What were the effects of the slave trade? African societies lost generations of young and their strongest. What were some of the effects of the slave trade? Well, African societies lost generations of their youngest and strongest to European traders and plantation owners who were taking the best, most athletic to their plantations. This is, as you see, a slave auction, and a mother and a daughter might get broken up here. And that's what also happened. African families were torn apart. Many slave owners did not buy families. They bought individuals and treated them all like property. Another effect of the slave trade was that African culture diffused around the world, to Europe, to South America, to the Caribbean, to North America. So the music and the food of different African groups were spread and diffused. How can the world heal from the evils and pains of the legacy of slavery? When you own and buy a human being, that is the definition of evil. And how can we, as a world, as a country, heal from that? Many people have many ideas. There is one more recent journalist, Ta-Nehisi Coates,